Hey, it's Sam. I'm making this quick video here in lovely San Francisco. And it's the day after the equinox. Equinoxes are very important solar phenomena, and they refer to the equal day and the equal night on Earth. And of course, depending on which hemisphere you live in, depends on which equinox you are experiencing. So here in the northern hemisphere, we're experiencing the autumnal equinox, which is the sun moving south. Now, it's getting darker and darker. There's less and less sun in the northern hemisphere, starting from the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, which was about 3 months ago. Of course, if you live below the equator, now is the vernal equinox because the sun is moving north in the southern hemisphere. It's moving south in the northern hemisphere. So this issue of hemispheres and directions and north and south and all of that is one of the issues, if not the biggest issue of using a zodiac that's based on the seasons, a seasonal zodiac. It's a huge issue, and it doesn't matter what's written in certain texts where you can then find some way to kind of say, oh, well, that's not really what they meant. It is the implications of the what you would call a tropical zodiac or a seasonal zodiac is the direction the sun is moving. The only reason it's called north and south in the Indian text is because north means it's more light is going to be in that hemisphere for that period of time. So this is why on the winter solstice, this is when the sun begins moving north, which means there's going to be more light in the northern hemisphere for the next 6 months. But the winter solstice, what we call winter solstice, which is December 21st in the northern hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere, that's the first day of summer. So that's the first day that the sun starts moving south if you're in the southern hemisphere. So all of these directions related to solstices and equinoxes are completely hemisphere based because they refer simply to the movement of the sun. The apparent movement of the sun. It's the movement of the earth around the sun. And so this is why you didn't see in Indian astrology, the wise Indians kept the solstices and equinoxes separate from the zodiac because they're separate things, completely separate things. The zodiac is how we measure objects moving around the earth, right? Very different than the earth going around the sun. You don't need a PhD to tell you that. You instinctively, you know that. And they instinctively know it. And then when the zodiac was changed, when the sidereal, because the zodiac is sidereal in origin, measuring objects moving around the earth based on precise ecliptic coordinates, when that was changed by the Greeks, the Indians resisted, because you want to understand something about the tropical zodiac. And again, I've never said that it's wrong. I've never stated that, and I never would, because there's a whole astrological tradition, particularly the Western astrological tradition and techniques that grew up around looking at the sky that way, measuring objects moving around the sky based on the what we call the tropical zodiac. But we have to understand that the tropical zodiac, what we're calling tropical zodiac, is essentially a solar almanac for the northern hemisphere. I mean, when I say even essentially, it's not even essentially, that is what it is. Only we're taking the solar almanac for the northern hemisphere and using that to calculate objects moving around the earth. So there's nothing wrong with having a solar almanac for the northern hemisphere. It's perfectly, this is what the Indians were doing in the Vedas. They had a solar almanac for the northern hemisphere and they called it a calendar, and their months were based on those portions. It's perfectly fine to do it. That's what it is. That's what it's for. This is why the tropical zodiac, or I don't like to use the tropical zodiac because now that means the zodiac. This is why a solar almanac for each hemisphere makes a lot of sense. And it should be connected to solstices, equinoxes, seasons, and 12 months. Again, this is what the calendar is. So again, you want to keep those things separate, regardless of how people might try to be creative and say, well, but the zodiac is extrapolated from the this and the that. Actually, no, it's not. It's just not true. It's not. It was joined to that. It was pinned to that because you had the 12 zodiac portions, and then you had 12 months, and so the Greeks joined the two. This is literally, we don't need a PhD, again, to see that that's what it was. Because the Indians had 12 months, they had 12 Saura months, or solar months, which is the same as the solar almanac that I just mentioned. Basically, they were using that tropical zodiac, but it wasn't a tropical zodiac, it was a solar almanac. They knew the difference. Joined the seasons and equinoxes, but measured with the zodiac. Things are measured with the zodiac, both in space and in time. That's what a zodiac does. It measures things, right? And so on the equinoxes, it's an important time to remember that they're hemisphere-based. And this is something that, especially we Northerners, Yankees, we Northerners forget that there's another part of the world that live below the equator, and it's not their vernal equinox. It's not their autumnal equinox, it's their vernal equinox. So to all my southern friends in the Confederacy, the Confederacy of the globe, happy vernal equinox. You're getting more light now. Now you're moving toward summer in the southern hemisphere as we move toward winter in the north. It's important to remember what the seasonal zodiac is about, what the seasons are, and understand that they're separate from the zodiac. And even to say a seasonal zodiac is in some ways it's kind of a misnomer. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong because there's a whole astrological system that developed around it, and that system, which you would call Western astrology, is actually really, you can see how the zodiac even is reflected in a lot of their methods and techniques, because they have a lot of things like progressions and it's very open. It changes a lot, just like the zodiac has changed. And their calculations have changed over the years based on what's called the eye nuptia, or the Earth's wobble on its axis. But again, it's one of the big issues with Western astrology even, that they have a hard time answering, if they can answer it at all, and that is, what about the southern hemisphere? Do you now flip the chart upside down? If it's seasonal based, if Aries is Aries because it's the first day of spring, well then south of the equator, Libra should have all the qualities of Aries, and it should be flipped upside down if it's all about seasons and all about directions. Again, the only reason we're even having these conversations is again, it's not because I have any problem with the tropical zodiac, or even people using tropical version of the zodiac and practicing Indian astrology. It's the reason that I started making videos is because there's so much misinformation, and I see it getting corrected, which is good. I don't see people saying things anymore. I've seen Facebook pages updated and things changed where people have stopped saying things like, I practice astrology the way it was in the Vedas, using tropical zodiac. I've maintained since I started making these videos that there are like 3 or 4 things that people need to stop saying. Number one, that they were always using tropical zodiac in the Vedas. Indians always use tropical. It's supposed to be tropical. All of that stuff, I've said that's not correct. And the only things I've done is show where that's not correct. I've showed that Indians were not using tropical zodiac in the Vedas. Clearly, they weren't. So those statements are incorrect. They're not correct. I've showed very clearly why the Indians used sidereal. Once the tropical zodiac arrived from Greece, even though the rest of the world started to use it after several hundred years, the Indians didn't. And they didn't because they never had. And even though there are issues with calculating Ayanamsha and exactly, how to use the Chitrapaksha Ayanamsha and exactly where you find that, or the end of Revati and other indications, it's very different than saying, oh, that means we're supposed to use the tropical, quote, tropical zodiac. Which again, the tropical zodiac itself is joining of things that don't really go together. It would be like the Indians joining their months with the nakshatras and with the calculations. So this whole relationship of using the solar almanac of the northern hemisphere to measure objects moving around the Earth has been called into question now for a couple centuries. This is why there's a pretty strong sidereal Western astrology movement. Because when people went back and looked, they realized that in some ways it's kind of irrational. Again, it doesn't mean it's not to say it doesn't work or anything like that. But again, you want to understand what the tropical zodiac is. It's literally an almanac, which means it tracks the northern and southern movements of the sun in the northern hemisphere. All of the delineations are hemisphere-based. And this is just most precise. Astronomers, astrologers, many do not think this is a legitimate way to be tracking objects moving around the Earth. That's a very different thing than saying, well, where exactly does that 0 point of the zodiac begin? That's the sidereal dilemma. The problem with sidereal is where exactly is that 0 Aries? Where exactly is opposite Chitra, the Chitrapaksha calculation? We have different calculations. And again, as technology improves, we get better at making those calculations and those formulations. And it's an issue that needs to be addressed for sure. That's very different than saying, well, because we're not exactly sure, we should be measuring objects moving around the Earth based on a solar almanac of the northern hemisphere. Very different. So besides all of that, the equinox is a time when we're, I guess trying to achieve a certain balance, you might say, but balancing different things. Again, if you're living in the northern hemisphere, like I am, you're moving from summer, you're in that equal point between summer and winter. That's the autumnal equinox, right? As the sun is getting darker in the sky. If you're in the southern hemisphere, you're moving from winter to summer, and you're at that equal point. It's the vernal equinox in the southern hemisphere as there's more and more light in your hemisphere. And one of the things we can know about the equinox, it's the day where it's equal, but it also means that for the next 6 months, there's going to be more light or darkness in one hemisphere than the other. Because before the equinox, there was still more light in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, counting back to the previous 6 months. But now there's going to be more light in the southern hemisphere for the next 6 months and more darkness in the northern hemisphere for the next 6 months. Because the equinox is the day where it's equal, but then the second after the equinox, and by the way, it's not a day, it's a moment. There's a moment where it happens. And those precise moments are important. Just to say, one of the real, I guess you would say, arguments, or one of the cases to be made for using what you would say seasonal-based calculation is that there are these precise moments, because equinoxes and solstices are precise events. It's not a day, it's a moment, and you can measure that moment precisely. So those who use the tropical zodiac would say it's more precise than the Indian Ayanamsha, which you don't know exactly where that is. Again, that's a legitimate point. I've never said it's illegitimate. This is why I would never say it's illegitimate. There's a legitimacy to it. I would never be so fanatical as to say it's completely wrong, it should never be used. Of course not. But you have to know that many of those who are the tropicalists in Indian astrology, who are using the Indian method, say sidereal zodiac is a mistake. They say it's a mistake. Not even that it's not correct, it's a mistake. So anyway, there's a legitimacy to the calculation because there are precise moments. And you can anchor, quote, the zodiac on that precise moment, but it keeps moving over time. And now, again, especially once you start using fixed stars and you start using nakshatras, which are all part of the Indian system, then this slippage becomes not just crucial, but fatal. Because nakshatras and rashis are connected. They were always connected in the text, in the astrological texts. Nakshatras, rashis occupy the same space as it says in Parashara, in Varahamihira, in all of the texts since. You don't have two zodiacs moving. You don't have a tropical or a seasonal way to measure the signs and then sidereal nakshatras. It's not in any text. And in practice, it's totally impractical. So this is why in the Western astrological system, it really is not as crucial. But even in that system, when you start looking at things like Regulus, which is in the constellation of Leo, is now in Virgo, certainly when you're talking about Vedic astrology, it doesn't make sense because nakshatras and rashis are connected. Leo is related to Magha. I mean, Magha is a section of Leo, for example. So don't need to get so into that. But this is how you can understand how what these two zodiacs are about and why there's even, quote, a debate, so to speak. There's not much of one. You see it a lot on YouTube because the YouTube astrologers, have people that watch them, and that's fine. It's fine with me. It really is fine that people wind up doing it. But I started making videos because I wanted there to be an answer, because for years there was no response. It was just this over and over again. So I'm glad that the tune is changing at the very least, and people are ceasing this crusade of especially false information that Indians were always using tropical in the Vedas. Not true. That rashis are inherently tropical. Not true. They were sidereal. They became tropical with a very specific move and a highly unintuitive one to most people. And that if the Indians had have known better, not been so dopey, they would have known that. Again, just not sensible. So anyway, not to get so off on that because it's not really been occupying my mind as much. There's certainly quite a few more things that I will be talking about relative to text and other things, but the equinox, it's a good time to actually just really describe what the equinox is. And by the way, the Indians, especially in their later text, especially in texts like Muhurta Chintamani and other texts, you see them talking about the Sayana zodiac or the seasonal zodiac or what we might call tropical zodiac. They talk about it quite a bit. They were aware of the zodiacs, for sure. They were aware of both zodiacs. And they clearly chose the one that we use to measure objects moving around the earth. They weren't confused. There were some things that got confused, which I'm going to talk about, particularly the Makara Sankranti, and there are confusing statements in some of the texts, which I'm going to be talking about. But anyway, it's a time of balancing and bringing things into equilibrium. And I hope you're feeling good in that regard.